further debate, I recognize the member for Niagara Centre.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker. It's an honour to speak in this House, particularly on matters of housing that are of grave importance. The need for more affordable housing is dire in my riding of Niagara Centre and across the province. However, Bill 108, More Homes, More Choice Act, will not actually create more affordable housing. As a two-term councillor and budget chair, I know the pressure municipalities are under. This bill amends 15 acts. The acts were put in place to safeguard our environment, species at risk, our health, and our history. They are now facing changes that strip them down in order to appease developers under the guise of affordable housing. Bill 108 states a vision of affordable housing, but introduces measures that will only make housing less affordable. This is a bill for developers. The bill further alienates municipalities and forces them to be reactive instead of proactive. This bill has a few interesting provisions that seemingly don't belong in a housing bill, and I'm going to address those first. The bill is transparently a pro-development attempt at a market solution for housing availability, while simultaneously gutting provisions that help individuals and families find an affordable place to live. I'll start, Speaker, with the Cannabis Control Act and those changes. This Schedule 1 amends the Cannabis Control Act to give the police and courts more authority to crack down on illegal cannabis sales that take place in residences. As it currently stands, Section 18 of the Cannabis Control Act gives the police the power to shut down and remove people from premises where they believe cannabis has been illegally sold or distributed. There is currently an exception for residences. Bill 108 removes this exemption. This would allow the police to enforce the law where an unauthorized dispensary operator claims their store is their residence, but it would also seem to allow the police to expel a family from their home if they think a family member or a visitor sold cannabis. Similarly, residences are currently exempted from provisions in the Cannabis Control Act, allowing the court to order the closure of premises for up to 2 years if someone has been convicted of illegally selling or distributing cannabis in the premises. Bill 108 removes this exception. Since commercial landlords are currently subject to penalties if they knowingly allow their tenants to illegally sell or distribute cannabis, these penalties will now be extended to residential landlords. Bill 108 also introduces new minimum penalties for landlords. We have some concerns, Speaker, on what this will mean for families. Cannabis is currently legal, and while the illegal sale of cannabis should not be prohibited, giving the ability for a family to be expelled from their home because a family member, or worse, a visitor, engages in an illegal activity is unthinkable. Under Schedule 10, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, this schedule amends the Occupational Act to expand the Chief Prevention Officer's authority with respect to the certification of Joint Health and Safety Committee members, including the power to revoke or amend the requirements for certification. And Schedule 13, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, is amended to allow the WSIB to establish an insurance rate for partners and executive officers of a construction company who do not themselves perform construction work. This rate can be different from that charged to the employers of the partners and executive officers. My concern regarding Sections 8, 10, and 13 is what does this mean for the safety and the protection of workers? And if a Chief Prevention Officer has the authority to revoke or amend the requirements for certification, what are the ramifications of this? The bill is unclear. Beyond the above, how these sections contribute to growing more affordable housing in this province is unclear to me. We are confused as to why these are included in this bill. Speaker, this government is yet again taking aim at the environment. Schedule 2, the Conservation Authorities Act, amends the Conservation Authorities Act to set new standards of conduct and to limit what costs can be unilaterally imposed on member municipalities. Bill 108 will require Conservation Authority members to, quote, act honestly and in good faith with a view to furthering the objects of the authority. The Act was amended in 2017 to allow the Lieutenant Governor and Council to prescribe mandatory programs for conservation authorities. Bill 108 restricts this regulatory authority to prescribed programs related to natural hazards, land conservation and management, and duties assigned under the Clean Water Act or another prescribed act. And in the case of the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, the Lake Simcoe Protection Act. Oddly, there is no specific reference to the Great Lakes Protection Act, which envision an important role for conservation authorities in protecting the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin. Conservation authorities may continue to enter into agreements with municipalities to deliver other non-mandatory programs on their behalf, subject to periodic review. But after a prescribed date, conservation authorities will be prohibited from billing a municipality for any capital or operating costs related to a non-mandatory program, unless the Conservation Authority Act has entered into agreement with that municipality. This, Speaker, drastically restricts the work that conservation authorities do. The minister may appoint investigators to examine the conduct of an authority's operations. However, there is no provision to enable the appointment of a supervisor to take over a rogue conservation authority, as my predecessor, Cindy Forster, and myself have demanded following a series of controversies involving the Niagara Region Conservation Authority. Conservation authorities provide a vital service of ensuring that conservation, restoration, and responsible management of hydrological features through programs that balance human, environmental, and economic needs. But occasionally, conservation authorities can be taken over by pro-development councillors or representatives who have a vested interest in ensuring that large developers get their way. We saw that in Niagara, Speaker, where my predecessor rallied for years for the provincial government to get involved in the conservation authority that was embroiled in controversy. They were advocating for the deeply controversial project of biodiversity offsetting, which I will talk about later. They brought in a series of human resource issues where staff reported abuse. They sued a private citizen who brought the concerns to light. Cindy Forster, my predecessor, was able to secure an Auditor General audit into the Niagara Regional Peninsula Conservation Authority, and thankfully the organization appears to be on the mend. But in a time of increased natural disasters, flooding, and cities across the province declaring climate emergencies, we must ensure that the conservation authorities on the ground are dedicated to maintain balance and ensure responsible development. It is a positive that now an investigator can be appointed, but I would suggest that a supervisor role should be an option that is provided. With respect to the environment, Speaker, we would not be reviewing a bill from this government if it didn't have some provisions that would allow for the degradation of our environment. My colleague from Toronto Danforth outlined in an earlier debate of this bill just how bizarre it is to add changes to the Endangered Species Act within a housing bill. He's never seen it. Yet here we are presented with Schedule 5. It amends the Endangered Species Act to reflect proposed changes announced in April that gave the minister sweeping powers over the species listing process and more flexibility to suspend the application of the Act, sometimes in exchange for payment. Bill 108 extends the deadline for prescribing a species as threatened or endangered. Currently, regulation must be made within 3 months of the minister receiving a report from the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, CISERO. Bill 108 extends this timeline to 12 months, with the exception that if the minister sends back the report to CISERO for reconsideration, in which case the 12-month period begins after CISERO submits a second report. Speaker, this extends the timeline significantly and allows for the government to delay the designation of endangered species. Let's say there is a development in process that would severely damage the habitat of an endangered species. With this newly extended process of prescribing a species endangered, what does that mean for a species not yet designated? The timeline is extended, the development starts, and that species is not protected by this legislation. The minister may temporarily suspend for up to 3 years some or all of the prohibitions that would normally apply once a species is listed for the first time. The minister may also exempt certain persons from certain prohibitions for up to 1 year if they were authorized to conduct otherwise prohibited activities prior to the listing. As Speaker, packaged together with the extension of the prescription process, this results in a massive loophole for developers to take action that would threaten a species. We're facing a nearly doubled prescription process, and once that species is listed for the first time, the minister can exempt certain people from prohibitions for up to 1 year. This is a functional removal of the legislation that protects endangered species. If a species is at high risk within Ontario, but at lower risk elsewhere, then the lower risk applies to the species classification. And in addition, instead of submitting a report to the minister when a need arises, Casera must wait until January to submit a report, unless a species is at imminent risk of extinction or expiration. Subject to the special requirements in Section 567, the minister may limit the application of prohibitions that would normally apply once a species is listed as endangered or threatened. This is a weakening of protections, as currently the minister now has 9 months to publish an action plan in response to either a recovery strategy for an endangered or threatened species. Speaker, wildlife experts say that the changes included in this bill would gut protections for the province's at-risk animals and plants. It severely weakens the classification criteria, allows the Environment Minister to delay protections for up to 3 years. 3 years, Speaker. Exempts persons, that is developers, industry, and others, whose actions will impact the habitat of endangered species, giving them a full plate of options to continue their activities, including a fee-in-lieu fund. So if you're a deep-pocketed developer, Speaker, all you need to do is present your case to the minister, contribute to the fee-in-lieu fund, and you can permanently damage the habitat of an endangered species and further contribute to the process of forever changing the landscape of our province and our planet by driving that species to extinction. In a recent article in the Toronto Star, Kelsey Scarfone, Program Manager at Environmental Defence Canada, said it really is a doomsday scenario for endangered species in this province. It's basically been whittled down to nothing. They might as well have just cancelled it. The article goes on to outline how wildlife biologists and conservation policy experts are alarmed over a provision in this bill that requires the committee of scientists that recommends the species at risk listings to the ministry to look beyond its classification in our province to how the species is classified elsewhere. For example, if a species has a special concern designation rather than an endangered designation, the committee must use the lower classification. This will have devastating effects. Critics are stating that these amendments are scary and irresponsible and could lead to the delisting of many of the endangered species listed in Ontario. It fails to recognize that a species can be endangered in one area but have better terms of survival in others. As the member from Kingston and the Island pointed out in question period last week, the United Nations released an 18,000-page report prepared by over 450 scientists outlining that there are 1 million species currently at risk of extinction. The only upside to this report, it's not too late. It will take transformative change in every aspect of how we interact with nature and our environment. Of course, this government takes the situation from bad to worse. Critics say this government is sprinting the other way by not only upholding the status quo, but expanding the ability to damage endangered and at-risk species. Shane Moffat of Greenpeace says that this government is, quote, sending in the bulldozers. Going on to say, the report really makes it clear if we're going to prevent this crisis of biodiversity, that means an end to business as usual. We don't see a sign of that in Ontario. In a way, what the Premier is doing is worse than business as usual. Yep. Speaker, with respect to the Environmental Assessment Act, this amends the Act in line with proposed changes announced in April 2019, with the goal of focusing, quote, focusing on projects that pose actual real risks to our environment and communities, streamlining approval timelines, and eliminating duplication. A class environmental assessment is a streamlined process intended for routine projects that have predictable and manageable environmental effects. Bill 108 allows class environmental assessments to exempt certain undertakings within the class from the Act, and it will specifically exempt low-impact projects within specified schedules of various class environmental assessments. Section 16 of the current Act deals with requests for a bump-up from a class environmental assessment to a full individual environmental assessment under Part 2 of the Act. The Minister currently has broad authority to order such a bump-up after considering certain matters. Bill 108 will now only allow the Minister to order a bump-up if the order may prevent, mitigate, or remedy 1. Existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, or 2. A prescribed matter of provincial importance. Now only persons resident in Ontario may request a bump-up instead of any person. Speaker, Bill 108 weakens the classification process for species at risk. It gives the Minister the power to delay protections for endangered species that are typically automatic. It allows them to assess which species are at risk by its biologically relevant geographic range. It indefinitely allows the government to relay their response statements about species at risk, creates an opportunity for developers to pay in lieu instead of undergoing requirements mandated by the existing Endangered Species Act, removes the requirement for the Minister to consult with an independent expert and get cabinet approvals, and gives developers even more powers than the above by giving landscape agreements for developers who seek to build multiple projects in one area. Speaker, yesterday we considered a climate emergency bill, and we had a lengthy discussion in this chamber, and it's absolutely incredible that not only does this government not have a plan for climate change, not have a plan for the environment, but they pass bills that will actually endanger species that are not endangered and push to extinction species that are endangered, and give developers the opportunity to pave over wetlands by paying basically a fee. Absolutely incredible in this day and age that a government would go down that road. Pay to play. Next, Speaker, I'd like to address the OMB and Heritage Act. Beyond environmental concerns, this bill restores many of the failures of the OMB. Schedule 9 of Bill 108 amends the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act to enable changes to how certain Planning Act appeals are handled, reflecting the restoration of appeal rights for developers in Schedule 12 of Bill 108. It strengthens the authority of the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal to require participation in an alternative dispute resolution. Non-parties to a proceeding may make submissions in writing only, and the Minister now has the broad regulatory authority to provide for transition, including the authority to decide whether prescribed classes of appeals shall be heard under the current system or the new system. This authority applies retroactively. Section 36 of the Act and Section 94 of the Ontario Municipal Board Act before it has long allowed the tribunal, on its own volition or upon application by a party, to make a case and receive an opinion from the divisional court on a question of law. In Bill 108, this section is repealed, meaning that if the LPAT or parties have concerns about jurisdiction, procedures, or other questions of law, they will no longer be able to ask the LPAT to seek clarity from the court prior to a decision. The LPAT recently requested an opinion under Section 36 with respect to a major ongoing case involving the proposed rail deck park. There are many such cases, Speaker, and this legislation will seriously damage the ability of individuals and community groups to challenge developments. Sections 32 to 42, which govern how specified Planning Act appeals are to be managed, are repealed, reflecting the restoration of appeal rights for developers in Section 12. Now, these appeals will be managed in the same way as other appeals. However, these Planning Act appeals are still subject to a mandatory case management conference. This section raises huge concerns with the rights of third-party appeal rights. No third-party appeals of non-decisions of official plan amendments or subdivision plans are allowed. Utilities and other specified infrastructure companies may still appeal subdivision plan decisions, but no one else can. It is a huge giveaway to developers and utility companies. Effectively, this creates a situation where groups that provide valuable insights into the effects of a decision have no opportunity for appeal. Let's say there is a proposal to build a new subdivision over a provincially significant wetland, which we have many in Niagara, for example. Or if a municipality fails to make a decision about a request to amend an official plan to allow a garbage dump next to a drinking water source. In either of these cases, an environmental group would not have the ability to appeal that decision. In Niagara, development on the Thundering Waters lands has brought huge controversy over the years. A few years ago, Speaker, a China-based investment company bought 196 hectares of land west of Marineland and adjacent to the Thundering Waters Golf Club in Niagara Falls. They proposed a $1 billion development and a pilot project for biodiversity offsetting. This property includes protected wetlands, but also adjacent areas that are necessary in order to protect the wetlands from invasive species. Now, for those who aren't aware of what biodiversity offsetting is, this is the kind of thing we're going to get into as a result of this bill. Biodiversity offsetting is a plan that the development community came up with when they're faced with wanting to build on a wetland, for example. They decide that they will create a wetland of equal size somewhere else. And I'm not joking, Speaker. That's actually a development plan that developers have come up with. It's obviously been successfully challenged because any scientist or anyone with common sense knows that you can't create a wetland that takes thousands of years to become what it is and just create one in another area that the developer doesn't want to build on. But those are the things we're going to be faced with as a result of this bill. The advocacy for biodiversity offsetting was concerning for a number of reasons. It involves the destruction of one wetland and replacing it with another in a different area. Environmental advocates questioned what it meant for the species living in the original wetland, and the developer had no response. Many environmentalists raised concerns. It led to a campout in the area of Thundering Waters. Their concern was the habitat of the blue-spotted salamander and black gum trees in the area. There have been delays in this development over the concerns listed above. What will it mean for the 95 hectares of provincially significant wetlands? This December, crews at the Thundering Waters site damaged protected trees and wetlands while doing soil testing. Plans for the development have been on hold as they were being appealed before the local planning appeal tribunal. The appeal, as launched by Niagara researcher and environmental consultant John Bacher, who questioned the way provincial environmental regulations were interpreted when approvals were granted. After a decision of LPAT, it went back to the council where the public was allowed to comment on the development again. Council ended up accepting the development, but subjected it to 27 conditions and will require the developer to do more studies and implement further measures to prevent adverse environmental effects on the site. So the concept of biodiversity offsetting was exposed as a scam, but at the same time, there was a solution that was found under the former system. With the changes put forward by this government, John Bacher and the environmentalists would have no method whatsoever of recourse. The municipality's decision would be overruled by the decision of the OMB. This takes power away from people, away from neighborhoods, away from environmental groups whose motives are not profit, Speaker, but to protect the environment and to protect neighborhoods. To be completely transparent, or as the government would say, to be perfectly clear, essentially the changes made to the LPAT reinstate many of the problematic rules that made the OMB ineffectual in the first place. It's really OMB 2.0. The OMB is frequently criticized for delayed decisions, sometimes for years, as the appeals process allowed adjudicators to go back to the beginning in order to consider fresh evidence from all sides, ignoring the municipality's decision on the matter. Kristen Wong Tam, a Toronto City Councillor who represents Toronto Centre, stated that the move would effectively hand control back to developers. Councillor Josh Matlow stated that residents will be subsidizing growth to pay for community recreation, local schools, and basic infrastructure. Quote, today's announcement by the Ford government is a giveaway of the development and planning process to the development industry. They've gone back to a free-for-all for developers. Who is it that this government wants to make the decisions? Appeals processes are back, which were criticized for being too timely, but can only be used by developers. Municipalities lose their say because their decisions, even if they fulfill all of the regulations, are overturned. And in the case where an environmental group may want a say, they don't have the formal option of appeal. The member from Guelph outlined how the OMB hearing cost taxpayers more than $1 million in 3 years in his riding alone. LPAT was created to rectify the problems that plagued the OMB. It was not without its issues, but it respected the decision of municipal councils by only compelling adjudicators to test if the municipal council's decision conformed to local and provincial planning policies. We've gone back to the system where appeals can be made as if there were no decision from councils at all. Speaker, there was a case in Ottawa where after a council decision, the adjudicator said a developer could have a taller building if it had a wow factor. The minister has been stating that this move, quote, takes the best parts of the OMB and LPAT, but it really combines them to assure the opposite. The issues of very expensive, lengthy decisions are still prevalent. The cost burden on municipalities is still there. The exception is that now developers hold the power and the people have less of a say. Municipalities also now face restrictions on the designation of heritage properties. And in a part, Speaker, buildings, once their heritage buildings are gone, they're gone forever. This bill basically allows developers to plow heritage buildings into the ground with almost no warning. Under this legislation, municipal councils are now required to consider prescribed principles when identifying heritage properties or establishing a heritage conservation district. In addition to creating new rules for listing non-designated heritage properties, this bill also creates new rules that make it harder for municipalities to designate heritage properties. This bill also makes LPAT, not the municipality, the final decider with respect to municipally designated heritage properties and requests to alter heritage property. Currently, there is no appeal of a heritage designation by law. Bill 108 will now allow anyone within 30 days of the published notice to appeal the bylaw to the LPAT, who may dismiss the appeal or repeal or amend the bylaw as it sees fit. Cities are currently required to keep a list of properties that are considered to be of cultural heritage value. They do not have the full benefits of heritage protection, but it is required that owners of those properties have to provide 60 days notice before demolishing the building. This protects heritage buildings in heritage neighborhoods and gives the heritage committees in municipalities a second chance to review. This will be gone, Speaker, and I fear that heritage properties across the province will once again be bulldozed over for the sake of cheap development.
They're gone forever.
And once they're gone forever. Speaker, I'll talk now about affordable housing, which this bill was supposed to be about, but it really is about giving away housing and really the farm to developers. I have deep concerns over what this bill will mean for affordable housing in this province. This bill has no vision for affordable housing. We all seem to agree that we're in a housing crisis in Ontario. Where I'm from, in Thorold, a community in my riding, whether you're a senior, single, or a household with dependents, you'll wait anywhere from 6 to 10 years. 6 to 10 years for an affordable housing unit. St. Catharines, 3 to 13 years. Welland, 2 to 15 years, depending on your situation. Port Colborne, 3 to 13 years. Across Niagara, there are 6,118 people on the wait list for affordable housing. In London, there are 4,770 families, couples and singles, on the social housing wait list. That's a 34% increase from the previous year. In Waterloo, 4,000 people on the wait list. In 2018 in Toronto, there were 100,515 total active applications for subsidized housing. This is a housing crisis, Speaker, and we have a bill that does absolutely nothing whatsoever to increase our stock of affordable housing. The numbers are high across the province. There's no doubt it's a crisis. We're in an era of stagnant wages, increasing job precarity, and an overwhelming amount of need. We've spent over half an hour now discussing this bill, yet for a bill about affordable housing, it fails to address what it claims to, because it's not an affordable housing bill. It's a give everything to developers bill. Schedule 12 is functionally the only portion of this bill that addresses affordable housing in any way. It tweaks some provisions in the existing Section 16.3 of the Planning Act, which has required municipal official plans to include second unit policies to govern the creation of basement apartments, granny flat, coach houses, etc. Now these plans will not be able to arbitrarily limit homeowners to either one additional unit within the main home or in an ancillary structure, but not both. It's a good step, Speaker, but this is not a revolutionary approach to affordable housing, and it certainly does not do the massive amount of work that is needed to address the housing crisis in this province. Inclusionary zoning is an incredible land use planning tool that allows a municipality to require a certain amount of affordable housing units to be included in residential developments of 10 units or more. Municipalities can tailor inclusionary zoning to fit their local needs. It is the main tool to promote affordable housing units being built in municipalities. Yet Bill 108 has nearly completely clawed back the ability for municipalities to pass inclusionary zoning policies. Now inclusionary zoning can only apply to a protected major transit station area or to an area where a development permit system has been required by the minister. This bill seeks to just build more homes. There is no indication that these homes will be affordable. It is running on the premise that simply having new housing will mean that housing will somehow be affordable. The key is in the language, Speaker. The government in their plan states, quote, an increase in supply should help bring rents down. No, it won't. What about the people who are waiting in this province to make things more affordable? This bill will do nothing to make homes more affordable or to increase the number of affordable units available. It becomes increasingly clear that this bill is not about housing when you consider the patchwork of policies this government has passed that affect people who are looking for housing that is affordable. This November, this government announced that rent control rules no longer will protect tenants that will move into new residential units coming into the market. If you move into an apartment, a condo, or a basement unit that was first occupied as a unit after November 1st or 15th, 2018, there will be no legal limit set on how much your landlord will be able to raise your rent. No limit whatsoever. So this government has created a series of ways to speed up development. More homes, more choice, they call it, while simultaneously gutting the protections that would make those units affordable once they're built. What's worse is that there is ample evidence that this policy change will be an historic failure. We all know the tale of Mike Harris. He downloaded the responsibility of affordable housing, a textbook soft service, while simultaneously cutting municipal transfer payments. It was not a very brave move to offload an expensive responsibility in order to make it appear that his government was making financially responsible choices. Mike Harris downloaded $905 million in social housing costs to municipalities and gutted tenant and rental housing protection laws, including rent controls. We are still paying for those decisions today. His actions were done as an experiment to stimulate the private rental market by deregulating private housing and throttling Ontario's, at the time, vibrant social housing sector. After 6 years of the Mike Harris housing plan, the average rent for a typical apartment jumped 5.6%. It resulted in an affordable housing deficit of 74,000 units. In 2001, the province's rental vacancy rate dropped to its lowest level in a decade. Why didn't this market solution, deregulating the market, improve affordable housing? It was supposed to lead to a big increase in new rental construction by developers. The minister at the time, Al Leach, predicted that the removal of rent control would generate 10,000 new rental units. From 1995 to 2001, developers got nearly everything they asked for: less regulation, lower municipal taxes, direct grants and subsidies, and the option to raise rent. Yet this private sector still did not build. The answer is clear why they did not. There is no profit to be made from building housing for low and moderate income tenant households. If we're looking at a market solution, which is clear this government is attempting to do, it doesn't make financial sense for a developer to invest when they can get bigger returns on other types of development investment. It's economics, something this government says they understand, but they clearly don't, Speaker. This bill helps developers while using careful messaging to pretend this is somehow going to create affordable housing units, despite gutting rent control, gutting inclusionary zoning regulations. There are no clear targets or timelines for addressing housing supply or housing affordability. No details about provincial contributions to cost-shared programs under the federal housing strategy. No new money for social housing capital repairs. The Advocacy for Tenants Ontario released a statement regarding Bill 108. Ontarians are struggling to find and keep their affordable rental homes, they write, especially renters living on low to moderate incomes. Here's what the plan means for tenants across the province. The government hopes, and this is the Advocacy Centre for Tenants of Ontario, Speaker, the government hopes that developers will choose to build rental housing and that by creating more rental units, tenants will have more choice. But with no plans for expansion of social housing or incentives to develop new affordable rental units for low to moderate income tenants, only those tenants who can afford to pay at the high end of the market will have any more choice. Tenant protections, or once again, small landlords are being encouraged to create new legal secondary rental units like basement apartments. Inclusionary zoning would allow municipalities to leverage private development to require a certain percentage of affordable units. The government appears to intend to limit inclusionary zoning to areas that are generally high growth and are near higher order transit, reducing the power of municipalities to develop their own inclusionary zoning plan that takes into account local context and needs. The Housing Supply Action Plan includes making it easier for developers to build by making development approvals easier through changes to the Planning Act. This includes going back to the old way of dealing with developer appeals of local decisions and making it more difficult for local governments to control development. The proposed measures do not address the need for increasing the supply of affordable rental housing, a critical concern for low and moderate income households in the province. Speaker, the problems don't end there. When we talk about development charges, and we're back again to the days of Mike Harris, when he downloaded the responsibility of affording affordable housing onto municipalities, he knew they couldn't afford it. It's clear by needs seen today that municipalities still cannot afford the cost of affordable housing. Their only real revenue tool is property tax, which is what makes inclusionary zoning such an attractive option for municipalities who are feeling the squeeze. Development charges are frequently collected by municipal government to help pay for the municipal costs associated with urban growth. The Development Charges Act currently distinguishes between two classes of services to which development charges apply, sometimes referred to as hard and soft services. Hard services include water, sewer, stormwater and drainage, roads, electricity service, police, fire, transit, and some other services. Everything else is a soft service, including libraries, community centers, and daycare facilities. Development charges for hard services are levied at 100% of the capital cost, while soft services are subject to a 10% discount on the grounds that existing residents would benefit from the new facilities soft services would provide, libraries and daycares. Schedule 3 of Bill 108 now only allows development charges for these listed hard services, and they've added additional service, waste diversion. In a submission to the Minister on the Increasing Housing Supply in Ontario consultations, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario outlined the importance of development charges for the health of municipal government finances. Quote, development charges are a major source of revenue for cost recovery that funds the infrastructure needed for Ontario's growing communities. In 2017, 197 municipal governments collected about $2.3 billion in development charge revenue. At present, development charges only cover about 80% of the costs of growth-related capital. They are used throughout Ontario and especially in high-growth areas. Speaker, that means property taxes are currently subsidizing the cost of growth, and municipalities are currently falling short of achieving the principle of growth should pay for growth, a principle that has been respected by municipalities and by the provincial government for many years. As a recent paper from the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto noted, the burden on existing ratepayers is not only inequitable, but also leads to inefficiently low municipal service levels and other related problems for municipalities and the development industry. Inadequate development charge revenue will have negative consequences for this province, not just municipalities. AMO urges the government to consider 3 key points, Speaker. Development charges are not a root cause of the affordable housing and supply challenge in Ontario. Let me say that again. Development charges are not a root cause, as this government claims, of the affordable housing and supply challenge in Ontario. Even further to the point, development charges only apply to a small part of the housing market, new homes. They represent between 5 to 7% of the cost of a new home. A reduction in development charge collections will increase the cost of public services for all residents. This will increase pressure from taxpayers to constrain growth and to constrain demands on the already stretched property tax dollar. It will result in property tax increases, and this government will be the cause. Municipal governments and current property taxpayers do not have the means to subsidize developers in building new homes. Changes that reduced development charges have never resulted in reduced housing prices. Charges for soft services evidently will now be determined as part of the new Community Benefits Charges process, which is combined with the former Section 37 of the Planning Act. Currently, Section 37 of the Planning Act allows local municipal councils to authorize increases in the height and density of development beyond the limits set out in the zoning bylaw, provided they have enabling official plan policies in exchange for providing specified facilities, services, or matters such as the provision of public art or affordable housing. Under Bill 108, Speaker, Section 37 is repealed. Instead, the municipality may now pass a bylaw to levy community benefit charges to pay the capital costs of facilities, services, and other matters that are required because of a development to which development charges apply. It is not clear what required means and whether this can include things like daycares and social services. Section 37 has provided municipalities with a tool not only to develop more densely, which is what smart growth plans ask for, but helping reduce urban sprawl. And it's also provided many benefits to communities. In Toronto, the city planning staff analysis has identified that in the calendar years of 2013 and 2014, the city secured over $112 million in future cash contributions for approximately 204 community benefit capital facilities. In addition, the city secured 181 in-kind community benefit capital facilities that the owner-developer had agreed to construct. These in-kind or non-monetary obligations are generally secured through a letter of credit and are contractually enforceable by the provisions of a site-specific zoning bylaw and either Sections 37 or 45 agreements registered on title. Under the current changes, the municipality must first prepare a community benefits charge strategy that identifies how the money will be used. The community benefits charge is capped at a percentage of the appraised value of the land. The percentage is prescribed by the minister and can vary for different municipalities and classes of municipalities. The community benefits money must be kept in a special account, and each year the municipality must spend or allocate at least 60% of the money in the account at the beginning of the year. If the percentage prescribed by the minister is too low, then the principle of growth pays for growth will be undermined. The money will be lost. Municipalities will have an incentive to enable more sprawling developments in order to maximize the amount of community benefits in parkland that can be funded under the cap. Urban areas, Toronto, Hamilton, will suffer the most, Speaker, as their funding will be capped due to the size of sprawling developments. There'll be an incentive for sprawling developments because the money will be based on the value of the land rather than the density of the development. Even in Toronto, where we all know land value is very high, the amount of actual land under development may be very low in comparison to the number of new residents that will live on the redeveloped land. These changes open up the opportunity for a myriad of problems for municipalities. Again, it threatens the growth pays for growth principle and takes away a municipality's ability to add in inclusionary zoning, except in a very strict set of circumstances. The massive downloading of soft policies onto municipalities under the Harris government in the 1990s has resulted in an unmanageable amount of burden on Ontario municipalities, exasperated by the limited ability of municipalities to raise revenue and decreases in transfers from above. This government is replicating the exact same situation. This government continues to blame municipalities for their financial problems, and we heard more of that this week, Speaker. In the pre-budget report, the government blamed transfer payments. Municipalities are in this financial situation because the former Conservative government downloaded expensive services onto municipalities knowing that they didn't have the money or the revenue tools to adapt to demand. That is how we got into this situation in the first place. Speaker, I'll say pause for a moment and just say that I've been 2 terms city councillor, 2 years as a budget chair of a large urban municipality, And a lot of this presentation sounds like developer bashing, and I can understand why the opposition may think that. But the fact is, over my 2 terms as city councillor, I had an area of the city of St. Catharines called Meriton, which was actually a former industrial area with lots of brownfields, lots of development that needed to happen. I worked very closely with developers for 8 years as a city councillor and as a budget chair. And it's like anything else. It's like union leaders, business leaders. There are good developers and there are bad developers. We need developers. There's no question about it. And I've known some very good ones that I've worked with, but there are also a lot of very bad ones out there that are only in it for a buck. And those are the ones that these laws and acts are there to protect us from and to protect the environment. This is a bill that drastically slants the laws in favor of developers and basically gives them carte blanche to do whatever they want. So my concerns, Speaker, $2.3 billion in development charges is at risk, or at the very least in question. A $366 million cut to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing budget we're dealing with. No details explaining the 25% cut or what programs are expected. There have been cuts to public health, libraries, paramedic services, school boards. Cuts received in piecemeal after budgets have already been passed. And we've spoken before, what kind of partner? We tell municipalities that we want them to be partners. What kind of partner treats their partner like that? Actually cutting retroactively so that the government has to go back, not only raise taxes this year, as the Mayor of Toronto is saying, but raise taxes retroactively because they've been treated so bad and so unlike an actual partner by a government that's supposed to be working with them. Gas tax funding for municipalities remains at 2 cents a litre. The planned increase did not go forward, and instead the program is now under review. The City of Toronto says the cancellation of the scheduled increase represents a $1.1 billion cut to transit funding over 10 years for Toronto alone. The budget for the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs cut by $321 million. No details about what's being cut. Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund cut from $510 million to $505. Where are municipalities supposed to get the money, Speaker, for the services this government's Conservative predecessor, who it appears they're emulating, downloaded onto them? Mayors have told this government what this means. It means property tax increases. If you truly believe there is only one taxpayer, why make that taxpayer suffer? This government gets to offset the political blame for what will inevitably be service reductions or property tax increases. They get to appease their developer friends, and we know they're friends based off of conversations we've all heard. We know who they are, while alienating populations that are already disenfranchised. I think the driving principles of this bill are fundamentally clear. This is a pro-development bill. When you combine all of these provisions together, all it is a patchwork of policies that make life easier for developers and harder for municipalities, families, and they also degrade our environment. Time and time again, this government disrespects the relationship with our municipal partners. Harris downloaded the responsibility of affordable housing onto municipalities, setting up municipalities for failure in being able to adequately provide the need. This government is doing the same, but using piecemeal announcements to degrade the financial sustainability of our local partners. I'm actually being heckled by the progeny of the culprit. They continue to take away the powers of local decision-making, whether that be with the overriding their decisions on planning, downloading cuts to public health and paramedic services, or changing their elections in the middle of the game. Bill 108 touts this vision of choice, stating that they will make housing more affordable by increasing the supply. This is simply deregulation. There are no clear targets or timelines for addressing housing supply or housing affordability. There's not a single affordable housing unit being built in this bill. Bill 108 weakens the classification process for species at risk, gives the minister the power to delay protections for endangered species that are typically automatic. It allows them to assess which species are at risk by its biologically relevant geographic range. It indefinitely allows the government to relay their response statements about species at risk, creates an opportunity for developers to pay in lieu instead of undergoing requirements mandated by the existing Endangered Species Act. It removes the requirement for the minister to consult with an independent expert and get cabinet approvals, and gives developers even more powers than the above by giving landscape agreements for developers who seek to build municipal projects in one area. This bill, Speaker, only helps sprawl developers degrade our environment, our endangered species. It takes power away from democratically elected local officials and restores the deeply troubled OMB rules. As Greg Lintern, the chief city planner for the City of Toronto, said, building more housing can't be to the detriment of everything else. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. Questions and comments? The member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I listened to my honourable colleague and made a few notes, and I'd like to share that with you. First, I'm glad that he brought up the economics and understanding economics, because I think it's important for us to talk about that. And understanding economics will involve us understanding the basics of economics, which talks about supply and demand, Speaker. And that's very important to note, because when you have lack of inventory, you're going to face issues such as higher costs, higher prices, and as a result, less inventory for the people. And the housing prices, Speaker, younger generation in my family, for example, I can tell you, because of lack of inventory, Speaker, there are people that are working and in areas such as Toronto or in the GTA and have to live an hour and a half away from home simply because they can't afford it. That's the problem. For 15 years, the previous government, Speaker, allowed this to happen. It's like they went out of their way to make sure that this becomes the most challenging, most onerous for housing to be built. And as a result, who ended up paying the price? It was the people. And that was the problem with the last government, Speaker. In 2018, you'd have to have, when the report came out, that showed that you'd have 75% of your household income would have to go towards you having a chance of owning a house, Speaker, in Ontario. It's outrageous. Can you imagine 75% of your household income having to go towards purchasing a house? The last thing, that's unacceptable. And the last thing that my honourable colleague touched on was the environment. And I'm glad that he brought that up, because I really do think that we should, and I asked my honourable colleague to look at the environment, the Made in Ontario plan that the minister put forward, because it's one that is well thought out. It's good for the people.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Questions and comments? The member for University Rosedale.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you also to the member for Niagara Centre for your lengthy and thoughtful explanation about this bill. I represent the riding of University Rosedale. It's an area in Toronto that has a huge number of projects that are in development, or where there's applications that have already been submitted under the OMB or the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal. I've spoken to many of the residents' associations in University Rosedale. Many of them are very concerned about this government's decision to roll back the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal and move back to the OMB process. It is reasonable to expect the City of Toronto and residents to have a say over the kind of development that happens in our neighbourhoods. It is also reasonable to expect developers to pay their fair share to go towards the kind kind of hard and soft services that are needed to cater to the people that already live in the area as well as the residents that are moving in. That is a reasonable thing to do. And what really concerns me is that the evidence suggests and reality suggests that we cannot build our way out of the housing crisis alone. It is not inventory alone, because if it was, the City of Toronto would have a very affordable housing situation. We have more cranes operating right now in the City of Toronto than anywhere in North America, including Mexico and New York City. We are building already in the City of Toronto, but unfortunately, the cost of renting and the cost of buying in the City of Toronto is astronomical, because there is a whole lot more going on than just supply. We need to tackle the affordability piece of this issue, and that means looking at inclusionary zoning. It means properly regulating Airbnb. It means getting into the business of building affordable housing. These amendments need to be introduced into this bill.
Thank you. Questions and comments? The member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Pleasure to stand and rise and comment on the member from Niagara Centre's comments, and a few things. Bill 108, we updated the outdated and inefficient legislation, rules and regulations to enable us to cut the red tape that and would make it easier to build homes, create and project, and also jobs. In everything we've done, every program, policy, or decision, we've tried to put the people first. Our government has exempted new rental units from rent control to encourage new construction, and this should help bring rents down, and in turn make finding a new home more affordable. Rent control also discouraged landlords and home builders from creating more apartments. We've also worked on surplus property, the ministry that I am a parliamentary assistant to, Ministry of Consumer and Government Services. Ontario has spent millions of dollars every year to maintain unused government properties across the province. That's why we're doing our part there by freeing up that land to build new housing in communities across Ontario. We will sell hundreds of unused properties to build more homes, long-term care facilities, and affordable housing. Buying a home is one of the biggest investments that most of us will make in our lifetime. That's why this government is putting people first and looking at all stages of the new home building and the buying process to protect consumers. We've announced major measures to transform Terrion and the broken system that exists there. By the end of summer, key measures will be implemented to include public disclosure of executive and board compensation and updates to the Ontario Builders Directory to include information about new home builders and those with a history of condominium and project cancellations. So many people want to live close to transit or close to work, and we're working on investing in that infrastructure, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The member for Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Niagara Centre for his excellent presentation. You know, when I think of downtown Toronto and when I think of other cities that I've visited, one of the things that I see lacking is an old city. Imagine if governments of the past worked with developers and not necessarily for developers. I think that this legislation and a lot of the legislation that's coming before us is really, really contrary to even the base of this government. I've heard members on the other side, on the government side, get up and read petitions about puppy mills. I know I've spoken to some members offline and they've expressed interest in protecting the rights of species and animals, but legislation like this does exactly the opposite. And I'm telling the members, the government members, that you will wear this each and every time moving forward when a new development is being established or built in your constituency, and it's not going to fulfill the needs of the community, because what this legislation does, I don't think will increase the housing supply. It'll just reduce the quality of it, because protections exist exactly what they're named for, as protections. And so you are putting yourself in the crosshairs of the municipalities, of mayors, of councillors. You are just allowing developers to go against the will of their own communities by returning to the OMB. And I can tell you, fighting developers was one of the reasons I was interested in politics, and it's one of the issues that get my community the most frustrated when a developer comes along, ignores the needs and wishes of a community, and just builds whatever it wants just to make more and more money on the backs of the communities that now are forced to live in that new development. Please rethink this. You will disappoint your own communities with this legislation.
Thank you. We'll now return to the member from Niagara Centre for his 2-minute summation.
Well, thank you, Speaker. Thank you to the member from Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill, for his comments. I think there's a couple of things we're going to have to just agree to disagree on, and one of them is creating more inventory in the housing sector is not going to create more affordable housing. It may create more housing, but not more affordable housing. To do that, you need inclusionary zoning policies, and I disagree on that as fundamentally as I think to address the environment, you need carbon pricing, and if you don't have carbon pricing, it's never going to happen. So those two things we're just never going to agree on. But thank you for your comments. University Rosedale, the member, thank you very much, and I think it's a great takeaway that residents have to have a say, and this legislation obviously gives all of the control to developers and just takes away any kind of appeal process for residents and community groups and environmental groups who I can give you examples have saved very valuable areas just in my own municipality. So that's going to hurt communities. Sarnia, the member from Sarnia-Lambton, sorry, but rent controls do not help people that live in poverty. I mean, getting rid of rent controls don't. Rent controls are what helps, and more affordable housing. So increasing the stock of housing without increasing affordable housing and then taking away rent controls are just going to be decimating to people who are living in poverty. To say that it's going to help them is just not true. And thank you to the member from Humber River Black Creek for his focus on Toronto. And large urban municipalities are really going to suffer under this legislation because they're going to lose a lot of the development charges that went into making sure that they had daycares and community amenities. Thank you, Speaker.
I can't read your mind. You're rising on a point of order? And Fanshawe is on a point of order.
Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to move a motion without notice regarding the late show in the name of the member for Essex.
Thank you. The member for London